When you hear the name Shirley Jackson, chances are you think of horror rooted in the home. That home might be the literal abode featured in The Haunting of Hill House, or Merricat's family estate in We Have Always Lived in the Castle. Or it might be a more abstract yet recognisable interpretation of home in the form of family or community, like the kind Mrs. Hutchinson finds herself at the mercy of in The Lottery. And because Jackson wrote about the time and place in which she lived, when you hear the name Shirley Jackson, chances are you think of a horror rooted in a typical middle-class, white, mid-century American home. Jackson, you might argue, takes what she sees around her, people, families, homes, communities, and turns them horrific, exposing their dark underbellies. But what if I told you Jackson's contemporary white, middle-class, mid-century American domestic horror, which you can learn more about here, link in the description, has its roots in a tradition much older, much more culturally and geographically far-reaching, and much more insidious than you initially supposed? Jackson may seem to situate her stories in a specific domestic sphere, but look past this veneer, and you'll start to see how the horror she crafts with such mastery is the stuff of centuries-old texts. Dangerous ballads, vicious early modern propaganda-peddling broadsides, and timeless tales of persecution and fear are welded into the very fabric of her storytelling. Jackson's is a timeless horror, one that feels at once a product of its time and place, relevant to modern readers, and thoroughly drenched in the malevolence of centuries past. This is the story of how that ages-old malevolence influenced Shirley Jackson's writing. It's the story of Jackson's fascination with and arresting use of the demon lover, an archetype you know intimately, one that permeates art, literature and media and has done since time immemorial. This is the story of black magic, witch hunts and brutal murder. And it is a story that begins not in Jackson's large middle-class drawing room, on her desk amongst her papers, but in the frigid and remote Scottish village of Aldern, 1662. But before we journey over the waters and back in time, welcome. I'm Dr. Rosie Whitcomb, this is Mousy the Macabre, and we make videos on all kinds of gothic literary goodness, so please subscribe if that's your jam. We're extremely grateful to our patrons over on Patreon. Thank you as always for your support, and if you'd like to join them, there's a link down below. And before we get started, please be aware this video contains discussions of domestic abuse, rape, body horror, murder, and misogyny. With all that said and done, let us don our warmest cloaks and sturdiest boots, light our candles as we trudge the isolated landscape of the Scottish lowlands to uncover the truth about a small and unassuming village with a dark and troubling past. Before we get to Jackson's exquisitely demonic storytelling, we need to understand how, where, and when the demon lover came into being and began his tirade. But remember, keep your eyes well peeled. You never know when things might take a disastrous turn. The year is 1662. The cold is brutal in the lowlands between Scotland's Cairngorm Mountains and the Moray Firth, not far from the frozen North Sea. In spite of the cold, and not far from the small village of Aldern, a woman is walking. The day is overcast, and the frost is hard. She paces quickly, almost losing her footing as she hurries to the warmth of the fireside and the embrace of her loving husband. Hell-bent on home, she almost misses him, the man standing by the ditch to her left. But he, it is certain, does not miss her. She stops abruptly and looks at him, surprised, her mouth slightly ajar. He is a large man with a dark countenance. He's a stranger to these parts, she can tell, but she doesn't move as he advances towards her. His touch is cold, but she does not flinch as he draws her to him and as he leads her away. She goes with him gladly. All thoughts of hearth and home and husband seem to evaporate from her mind. From this moment forth, she meets regularly with the strange man, and her life takes an unexpected turn. She feasts with the queen of the fairies. She sets a curse upon her neighbours' crops, drinks their wine, and fills the barrels with her urine, flies over their chimneys, kills their children. All this at his bidding. she cannot resist him. These are the very broad strokes of the confessions of Isabel Gowdy, Scotswoman and wife of a cotter who, in April 1662, admitted that she was so enamoured of this man that she would ken his voice at the first hearing of it and would go forth to him and have carnal copulation with him. Oh, yeah, her confession is written in Scots, so allow me to translate. Gowdy says she would know his voice at the first hearing of it and would go forth to him and have carnal copulation with him. The youngest and lustiest women will have very great pleasure in their carnal copulation with him. Yeah, much more than with their own husbands. And they will have an exceedingly great desire of it with him, as much as he can have them to him, and more. And never think shame of it. He is abler for it that way than any man can be. Alas, that I should compare him to a man. Only he was heavy, like a malt sack, a huge nature, that means penis, very cold, like ice. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, did any of that actually happen? Did Isabel Gowdy of Aldern really have sex with a man she identified in no uncertain terms as the devil, his penis cold as spring well water? And hey, I wasn't there. I can't tell you for sure. But no, it didn't happen. The question then becomes, why did she say these things? Why would she risk being executed, being burned at the stake, a punishment readily doled out in Scotland at this time? Surely she wouldn't have confessed if it wasn't true, right? Well, actually, she very well might have, because women, and I say women because while men were also accused of being seduced by devils and demons in Scotland in days gone by, it was mostly women bearing the brunt, more on that later. Women were very often tortured into confessing to the crime of witchcraft. Lucy Worsley explains.
Agnes Sampson had all her hair shaven off in each part of her body and her head thrown with a rope. But during this time, she would not confess anything until the devil's mark was found upon her privities. And then, when this happened, when they did this to her, she immediately confessed whatsoever was demanded of her. And goodness me, I'd do exactly the same thing.
One especially interesting thing about Isabel Gowdy's confession, and which forms the subject of this extensive textbook, is that she went into unusual detail about the harmful magic she performed, about the time she spent being intimate with the devil, in a way that was uncommon in witchcraft confessions of the time. She didn't have to confess, for example, that the devil's penis was bigger than any man's, or that the devil could satisfy a woman sexually in a way that no man could. This detail was unnecessary, incriminating, and provocative. Simply confessing that she had engaged in carnal copulations with the devil would probably have satisfied her interrogators. We don't know for certain why Gowdy confessed in such detail. We don't know whether or not she was tortured. We don't even know what happened to her. There's no record of her execution, although it was the likely outcome. What we do know is that this narrative of women succumbing to demonic lovers was nothing new. Isabel Gowdy wasn't the first woman to confess to witchcraft, and she wouldn't be the last. And while we don't have evidence that Gowdy was tortured into confessing, for other women, we absolutely do. Just look at this. This is an extract from a testimony given by an unnamed woman accused of witchcraft in Eichstätt in southern Germany in 1637. So, the accused is asked if she is a witch, and she says, "No, of course not, what are you on about?" Then, she's taken to a torture chamber, strapped to the strappado, which is this horrendous contraption, the use of which would cause immense pain and often dislocate the shoulders, and lo and behold, she changes her tune. After she is hoisted up a little, she says that yes, she could be a witch, yet when released, she announces she is not a witch. Therefore, she is pulled up somewhat higher, and then a second and third time, and then released on the admission that she is a witch. But immediately, she becomes stubborn and denies she is a witch. Then again, she is pulled even more tightly on the ropes. She confesses that 14 years ago, when she was unmarried, she had become a witch. What does this tell us? When she's being tortured and is experiencing extreme physical pain, she confesses, but when that pain is relieved, she retracts her confession because to confess seals her fate as a witch, which means she's most likely going to be executed. It's almost like, and bear with me here, she only confesses to being a witch to make the pain stop. Burn her anyway. But wait! Hold the kindling, I hear you cry, wielding your copy of Emma Wilby's The Visions of Isabel Gowdy. Contemporary research into false confessions also suggests that perfectly sane criminal suspects can cave in under the authoritative convictions of their interrogators, temporarily losing faith in their own ability to judge what they may or may not have done, and finally accepting the allegations made against them. And the fact that it was common for witchcraft suspects to subsequently deny or retract previous confessions also supports this thesis, psychologists having identified recantation as one of the core characteristics of this form of false confession. So when we see this woman confess, retract, it's actually a psychological symptom of the oppression and torture she's undergoing too. So don't murder her! Huh? This poor woman's experience was not isolated. She was one of many women tortured into confessing to having a relationship with the devil. Now, again, I want to make it clear that men were also accused of witchcraft and were executed during the early modern witch hunts. It wasn't just women being singled out for the pyre, but it was mostly women. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason the majority of people accused of witchcraft during the early modern period were women. The patriarchal injustice embedded... Oh, sorry, no. It's because women are the weak and whorish vessels of Satan. A woman, it was believed, was much more likely to be seduced by malevolent forces because she is more carnal than man, as is clear from her many carnal abominations. And it should be noted that there was a defect in the formation of the first woman, since she was formed from a bent rib, and since through this defect she is an imperfect animal, she always deceives. This quote comes straight from a little book called the Malleus Maleficarum, otherwise known as The Hammer of Witches, first published in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer, churchman and inquisitor, and it probably won't come as a surprise that it is quite literally teeming with the foulest of misogynistic hot takes. Here are a few of my personal favourites. I had rather dwell with a lion and a dragon than to keep house with a wicked woman. When a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil. What else is a woman but a foe to friendship, an inescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, a domestic danger, a delectable detriment, an evil of nature painted with fair colours? Well, someone's been to one creative writing class and thinks he's good enough to shove a cacophony of metaphors down your throat without questioning whether or not to run it by his editor. Oh, to possess such unearned confidence. Now, fortunately, Kramer's book was a bit of a misfire. Upon its publication, the Malleus Maleficarum wasn't taken especially seriously. Kramer was generally considered to be an intense, obsessive weirdo, and one of the prime targets of his weirdo energy was a woman named Helena Schuberin. So the story goes that Schuberin was outwardly critical of Kramer, calling him out in the streets, disagreeing with his sermons and what have you. Kramer wasn't happy about this, so in 1485, he put her on trial for witchcraft. But, as Jessica Ann Holt explains, Schuberin's trial did not go as planned. Kramer insisted on focusing not on Schuberin's links to malevolent acts, heresy, or the practicing of magic, but rather on her sexual history. Local authorities quickly put an end to the trial and dismissed the charges, leaving Kramer humiliated. Kramer, however, just couldn't let Schuberin go. Because he couldn't punish her in the way that he thought she deserved, which is giving extremely strong Hellfire vibes, he decided to journal all his frustrations. But instead of doing the decent thing and keeping his ramblings firmly to himself, he published them under the title of, you guessed it, the Malleus Maleficarum, or as this podcast puts it, a piece of revenge porn penned by a 15th century incel. And indeed, the Malleus linked the practice of witchcraft almost exclusively to women and to disordered female sexuality. The vibe of the Malleus is very much women are deceitful snakes, women are weak and easily seduced by the devil, women are witches who put curses on your penis to stop you getting a boner. They directly prevent the erection of the member, which is accommodated to fruitification, and this need not seem impossible when it is considered that they are able to vitiate the natural use of any member when they prevent the flow of the vital essences to the members in which reside the motive force, closing up the seminal ducts so that it does not reach the generative vessels or so that it cannot be ejaculated or is fruitlessly spilled. Someone's using clever words to legitimize his claim that the leading cause of erectile dysfunction and premature ejaculation is nasty women. Now, you might be tempted to look at Kramer and his medieval revenge porn and just dismiss it. As I said, people dismissed it when it was published. Kramer was in the minority. The Malleus Maleficarum wasn't significant. It didn't have any real impact. And that's where, I'm sorry to say, you'd be mistaken. Over time, the Malleus Maleficarum became something of a sensation. People were genuinely scared. The threat of witchcraft really felt like something to fear, and books like this only amplified that fear. It became a Bible for witch hunters. It might not have been popular upon its first publication, but as time ticked on and the fear of dark magic became more pronounced, texts like The Hammer of Witches began to have a devastating impact on people's lives. The ideas espoused within its pages helped to spur on and influence the early modern witch hunts, the likes of which destroyed the lives of women like Isabel Gowdy. Kramer's book was, over the decades, joined by a whole host of similarly deeply harmful and misogynistic texts, including Henri Bourgeois' 1602 text, The Threat of Witchcraft, which argued that not only do women love carnal pleasures, and this is why they just can't say no to the devil when he tries to f*** them, but that there is nothing which makes a woman more subject and loyal to a man than that he should abuse her body. That's got to be one of the most disgusting and harmful sentences I've ever read. And unfortunately, this connection between witchcraft, demonic sex, and sexual abuse is really common in these texts. In Demon Lovers and Their Victims in British Fiction, author Tony Reid quotes from Nicholas Remy, that's this guy, magistrate and demonologist who claimed to have personally presided over hundreds of witchcraft trials, and all female witches maintain that the so-called genital organs of their demons are so huge and so excessively rigid that they cannot be admitted without the greatest pain. The connection between sex and pain or cruelty, says Reid, seems unmistakably related to an urge to destroy. Rather than being a creative or procreative event, sexual union becomes a means of expressing hatred and evil. And to that, I would add that not only is demon lover sex destructive rather than procreative, but it's sex without pleasure, for the woman at least. Women have no agency here, are forced to do things, sexual and otherwise, against their will, and end up experiencing extreme suffering. But what I really want to focus on is just how central sex was to these texts, and to the early modern witch hunts in general. As Reid tells us, one of the central activities that supposedly took place during witches' sabbats was sexual adoration of the demon figure, including but not limited to sexual intercourse. Demon lover sex wasn't just a freaky sideshow act, secondary to poisoning the neighbours' crops and killing their cows. Engaging in abominable coitus was a very central concern. The cultural obsession with women being seduced or raped by devils and demons was extremely prominent, and, crucially, it formed the cornerstone of the narrative trope and character archetype that is the demon lover, destined to metamorphose through the centuries, travel across the ocean to North Bennington, a small town in the state of Vermont, and land on the writing desk of Shirley Jackson in the year of our Lord, 1949. If you're familiar with Shirley Jackson, and indeed if you're a returning viewer to this channel, you're probably at least somewhat familiar with The Lottery and Other Stories, Jackson's collection of short fiction which contains her most famous short story, The Lottery, as well as lots of other deeply disturbing tales that you can learn more about here and here. If you're really familiar with Shirley Jackson, you might be aware that this collection is split into 3 sections. The Lottery is in the 3rd section, for example. The Demon Lover, which we'll be examining shortly, is in the 1st. And if you're really familiar with Jackson and with this collection, you might also know that sections 2 and 3 are prefaced by quotes, and these quotes are worth paying attention to. They're both taken from a 1681 text by a man named Joseph Glanville called Sadducismus Triumphatus, or to use its full name, Sadducismus Triumphatus, or Full and Plain Evidence Concerning Witches and Apparitions in 2 parts, the first treating of their possibility, the second of their real existence. Now, in a nutshell, what Glanville is arguing for in this text is that witches definitely exist, that they practice malign magic, and that exercising a healthy skepticism about these facts is a fool's game. I'm not going to go into detail about Glanville's writing because, frankly, I've had enough of anti-witch, anti-woman propaganda for one video. What I am interested in is Jackson's choice to punctuate her stories with quotes like this. Why did she do it? And how does it reframe our understanding of her white, middle-class, mid-century domestic veneer? One answer to this is that Jackson did it because she was interested in it. She had a long-standing personal interest in magic, witchcraft, and demonology. But I think it goes deeper than this. I think Jackson is deliberately drawing a parallel between the persecution of women in centuries gone by and the persecution of women living today, today being Jackson's today, not ours. Jackson, we know, faced persecution herself. As Wyatt Bunikovsky writes, Jackson was often perceived as a strangely hybrid figure. housewife and mother, witch and writer. Not only Jackson's work, but her own identity was shaped by the parallel she found between the position of the witch, ostracised for her magical powers and their presumably demonic sources, and the position of the woman in the United States of the 1940s, who could herself be ostracised for stepping outside of rigidly defined gender roles. Even more, the position of the woman writer, whose powers of creative witchcraft could, with one stroke of the pen, produce charming stories about raising her children, and with another, could scandalise the genteel readers of the New Yorker with the story of a woman stoned to death. Jackson's own experiences of being persecuted for her witchery and for her writing come across in the suffering of many of her protagonists in The Lottery and Other Stories. By framing the collection with slivers of the kinds of insidious material that influence the persecution and murders of countless women, Jackson embeds centuries-old, real-life horror into her writing. We read in these stories of women accused, seduced, and tormented by men. And one man in particular, James Harris. James Harris, known variously as James, Jim, Jamie, Mr. Harris, or even represented through signs associated with the name, a tall man wearing a blue suit in particular, usually pursuing or threatening a female character, haunts this collection. The Lottery and Other Stories was, in fact, originally subtitled The Adventures of James Harris, which makes sense since he pops up all over the shop, assuming a number of different guises. At times, he appears to us in a somewhat palpable form, he feels present in the narrative, but more often than not, he's in the wings, casting a dark shadow over the story and over the story's heroine. Now, you might be sat there puzzled, perhaps even bemused. James Harris? James Harris? Is that name supposed to be threatening? Like, I know a James Harris, I chat with him awkwardly at the office, he's just a guy. But Jackson's choice to name her omnipresent figure of fear, torment, and mystery, James Harris, is not arbitrary. You need look no further than the very last page of this collection, to the epilogue, as Jackson terms it, to understand the dark and complicated origins of an otherwise nondescript name. She set her foot upon the ship, no mariners could she behold, but the sails were o' the taffety, and the masts o' the beaten gold. She had not sailed a league, but barely 3, when dismal grew his countenance, and drumly grew his ee. They had not sailed a league, but barely 3, until she espied his cloven foot, and she wept right bitterly. "Oh, hold your tongue of your weeping," says he, "of your weeping now let me be. I will show you how the lilies grow on the banks of Italy. Oh, what hills are yon pleasant hills, that the sun shines sweetly on?" "Oh, yon are the hills of heaven," he said, "where you will never win." "Oh, what a mountain is yon," she said, "all so dreary with frost and snow." "Oh, yon is the mountain of hell," he cried, "where you and I will go." He struck the topmast with his hand, the foremast with his knee, and he brake that gallant ship in twain and sank her in the sea. What we have here, crystallised into verse, is a woman being taken to hell against her will by a man who has made it his mission to seduce her. Where does this verse come from? Why, Jackson plucks it right out of a 17th century ballad called, drumroll please, James Harris, the Demon Lover. Popular in England and Scotland as early as the mid-17th century, and circulated ever since, the Demon Lover ballad is one of the earliest known iterations of the Demon Lover motif. Over the centuries, the motif transformed. Sometimes the female victim is sympathetic, sometimes not. Sometimes the name James Harris doesn't actually feature in the text, sometimes it does. Sometimes he's got cloven feet, sometimes regular old human feet. But the trope, at its bare bones, is an aggressive male presented as powerful, mysterious, supernatural, cruel, and obsessed, while the victim, always a woman in the ballad, is presented as vulnerable, malleable, and easily seduced and led astray. And, crucially, her encounter with the demon always ends badly. According to Reed, this trope has recurred through the ages because it demonstrates the power of men as well as the powerlessness of women, and serves as a warning to women who would assert themselves and exhibit their capacity for rational action. Over the centuries, writers have, of course, fleshed out this skeleton in different ways. A novel like Jane Eyre, for instance, takes a cue from the demon-lover dynamic, but what we get in that novel isn't an explicit powerful man, powerless woman dichotomy. Jane is assertive, and her capacity for rational action is, in some ways, rewarded. But even so, traces of the demon-lover linger. Exhibit A. Rochester is horrendous and abusive to both Jane and Bertha Mason, his first wife. Reader, I married him. Well, Jane, you really shouldn't have. He might not be a literal demon, he might not have cloven feet, and he might not be sending you on a one-way boat ride to hell, but he still bears all the hallmarks of a power-hungry, patronising, toxic, untrustworthy, and abusive dickhead. The point I'm making here is that though he may shapeshift, the demon lover is always with us. Sometimes he's pure evil, sometimes he's more psychologically complex, sometimes he reforms, and sometimes he even gets his comeuppance. But whatever the weather, he has his roots in the culture of fear that spurred on the gender-based violence of the early modern witch hunts. It can't be surprising at this point to learn that these ballads began circulating widely during the height of the early modern witch panic. Now, ballads are rooted in folk traditions and oral storytelling. They're traditionally considered the poetic form of the people, and as such, they reflect the hopes and fears of the community in which they first circulated. Where did this ballad first circulate? England and Scotland. When? Mid-1600s. What were the common people most afraid of in Scotland during this period? A shiny new penny for whoever shouts out the answer first. The full title of the oldest known iteration of the demon lover ballad is A Warning for Married Women, being an example of Mrs. Jane Reynolds, a West Country born near Plymouth, who, having plighted her troth to a seaman, was afterwards married to a carpenter, and at last carried away by a spirit. The manner how shall presently be recited. Aside from being extremely catchy, this title reveals to us the purpose of the ballad. It's a warning for women. Don't break off your engagement to one man and marry another. Don't cheat. But more broadly, don't stray off the beaten track. Don't go against the grain. It's better to live in fear than to be the object of fear. This is a warning for women, and it's also a warning about women. If you're a woman, you cannot be trusted. In other words, victim blaming at its finest. This is how Jackson concludes her collection of domestic horror stories, with an epilogue taken straight out of an early modern polemic that warns about women and warns women about the evil that can so easily befall them. Jackson's stories of women in suffocating domestic situations who end up, more often than not, suffering greatly with little to no hope of reprieve, also reads as a warning. But what Jackson is warning us about is different. Jackson reforms the warning for women, you might say. As Bonakovsky argues, Jackson's stories might also warn married women, or those about to be married, not so that they might protect themselves from demonic visitation by remaining at home with their husbands and children, but so they might recognise the destructive nature of an idea of marriage that confines a woman's desire within the most rigid parameters. Jackson takes the woman, the witch, and the demon lover of days gone by and rewrites them into something her mid-century readership can relate to. Her protagonist might not be a lowly country maiden accused of killing her neighbour's cows and cursing his crops. She might not be hanged or burned at the stake after enduring weeks of torture. But the horror she faces has roots in the same misogyny and suspicion that implicated her ancestors. And it is under the heavy, bloody and tragic weight of the history of the early modern witch trials that I think Jackson writes The Demon Lover, the most powerful and disquieting interpretation of this centuries-old demonic dynamic that I have ever read. She had not slept well. From 1:30 when Jamie left and she went lingeringly to bed until 7 when she at last allowed herself to get up and make coffee, she had slept fitfully, stirring awake to open her eyes and look into the half-darkness, remembering over and over, slipping again into a feverish dream. So begins Jackson's The Demon Lover, and so we are immediately thrust into the nerve-ridden, sleep-deprived domestic space of the female protagonist. Why is she so nervous and sleep-deprived? Well, as a matter of fact, today is her wedding day. She tells us as much as she begins writing a letter to her sister in her finest handwriting. Dearest Anne, by the time you get this, I will be married. Doesn't it sound funny? I can hardly believe it myself. But when I tell you how it happened, you'll see it's even stranger than that. Now, you might use this as an opportunity to reassure yourself that the protagonist is fine. She's just experiencing classic wedding day jitters. But there is nothing reassuring about the opening of this story. Right off the bat, we get the sense that our protagonist is naive, confused, delirious maybe. This isn't just a bad night's sleep. Feverish dreams, peering into the half-darkness and remembering over and over. Remembering what, exactly? We don't know for sure. There is a lot of tension here, a lot of unease, and that's before we get to the letter. Now, the content of the letter she's writing to her sister is curious, to be sure. She's quite deliberately setting up the mystery, a mystery which is never resolved. But the thing that stands out to me here is that she writes it in her finest handwriting. This feels performative, as though for whatever reason she cannot be herself, has to put on airs. This isn't natural or easy. And all this is made even more unsettling because she proceeds to stop and tear up the letter. The whole episode serves to distance the protagonist from her sister, and it actually reminds me of domestic abuse dynamics where the abuser drives a wedge between their victim and the rest of their family. What we essentially learn here is that the protagonist is very much alone. Her fiancé is conspicuously absent, and we might notice that his name is Jamie, aka James, aka James Harris, so we know in our bones that this isn't going to end well. But more on him later. One of the things I like about this story is that we spend a lot of time with this woman in this opening section. We learn a lot about her perspective and the way she thinks as she mulls around her domestic space. And what I'm left with is this overwhelming sense of an isolated mind becoming more and more fretful. Jackson captures that feeling when you're alone and you have too much time to overthink, runs with it and gives us no reprieve. It manifests in the way the protagonist spent almost an hour over her coffee and takes her time repeating mundane domestic actions like washing up, making the bed, putting out fresh towels, and staring out the window. It's there in the way she struggles to choose what to wear. Her blue silk dress is too plain, almost severe. Her print dress too young for her. In the way she looks at herself in the mirror with revulsion and engages in some pretty damning self-talk. "You're 34 years old, after all," she told herself cruelly in the bathroom mirror. 30, it said on the licence. It was 2 minutes after 10. She was not satisfied with her clothes, her face, her apartment. She heated the coffee again and sat down in the chair by the window. Can't do anything more now, she thought. No sense trying to improve anything the last minute. This is sad. It's familiar. It's menacing. And the ambiguity of that last line is potent. We could take it to mean that Jamie's going to be here any minute. There's nothing else she can do now in terms of tidying the apartment or choosing another outfit. We could read in it the protagonist's willingness to settle. She's 34, over the hill, of course, and on the cusp of being entirely unmarriageable. Looking through a darker lens, we could also read this as ghoulish foreshadowing. No sense trying to improve anything at the last minute. This is her 11th hour. This is her end. And it's also worth noting how Jackson builds this sense of isolation, tension and fear, not just through what the protagonist thinks, but how she thinks it. Jackson makes use of a narrative style called free indirect discourse, where the narrator's voice and perspective is blurred somewhat with the characters. It was too young for her, and it had a ruffled neck, and it was very early in the year for a print dress. But still, the way it trails off, the way it suggests to us an evolving train of thought, takes this narrative out of the ostensibly objective third-person perspective and into the mindset of the protagonist herself. We're no longer a detached observer. We are in her head. We're there with her as she ums and ahs over which dress to wear, and this has a powerful impact on our reading experience. We're made to feel more intimate with the protagonist, experiencing her thoughts and anxieties in real time. But we're also unsettled because we don't know, for certain, who has authority here. It's disquieting to have the narrative told in a way that raises questions about who is actually telling it. Ultimately, we don't actually know who is guiding us here. Unease ripples through these opening pages as the protagonist drinks more coffee, looks out the window, rearranges the towels again and again, performs these motions over and over until she can't take it anymore. It's 20-1. She's been waiting for Jamie since 10. Finally, she starts to snap. Now, suddenly, she was frightened. Waking without preparation into the room of waiting and readiness, everything clean and untouched since 10 o'clock, she was frightened and felt an urgent need to hurry. She got up from the chair and almost ran across the room to the bathroom, dashed cold water on her face and used a clean towel. This time, she put the towel carelessly back on the rack without changing it. Time enough for that later. The carefully kept domestic space begins to unravel here. The neatness, the order, and the facade the protagonist has been so tightly managing comes loose as fear becomes unmanageable. There's some really incredible language here. Waking without preparation into the room of waiting and readiness really shows up the extent of her performance. Even when she's alone, unobserved, in her own space, she must prepare to wake from a nap. But this honed contrivance gives way as she panics, as she almost ran across the room. She's on the verge of behaving in a way she shouldn't, without decorum, without restraint. After waiting, watching, ruminating and fretting, she can't contain her fear any longer. So she decides that instead of waiting for Jamie, she will go out and find him. But the situation doesn't ease. Almost as soon as the protagonist leaves the apartment and begins her search for Jamie, we get the pervading sense that she's being watched. She stood on the sidewalk so long that a woman, leaning out of a window across the way, turned and called to someone inside to come and see. And later, as she's muttering to herself, "No, no," she said aloud, hurrying her steps, and someone passing stopped and looked after her. She's behaving oddly in public. She's acting in a way that is not normal and not expected. Consumed by thoughts of Jamie, the carefully curated veneer she has adorned herself with begins to disintegrate, and she draws unwanted attention. Now, for those of you who have watched our Shirley Jackson domestic horror video, you might recognise a series of unsettling parallels between this story and another of Jackson's menacing masterpieces, The Renegade. Namely, in the way the protagonists in both stories are treated by their communities. Both protagonists, in comparable states of desperation and distress, look to their neighbours for help and are instead met with increasing levels of discomfort. In her attempts to find Jamie, the protagonist of The Demon Lover asks her neighbours whether they've seen him, but to no avail. Mr. and Mrs. Royster, the couple who rented an apartment to Jamie, raise more questions than they answer, evade the protagonist's concerns, and reveal a strangely limited awareness about their tenant. The man in the delicatessen is rude and unhelpful, and seems himself suspicious of the protagonist's questioning. Over the glass case of cold meats and cheese, she said timidly, "I'm trying to get in touch with a man who lived in the apartment house next door, and I just wondered if you know him." "Why don't you ask the people there?" the man said, his eyes narrow, inspecting her. Interacting with her neighbours, leaning on the people in her community in her hour of need, the protagonist is met, time and again, not with support or comfort, but with suspicion and derision. And this only gets worse. Rather than simply being rude and unhelpful, the people she interacts with in her community begin to frighten her. There's the florist who smiled genially, showing all his small teeth. A very simple description, but one that really gives me the ick. And who seems like he's trying to help her, but then he says, "I hope you find your young man," and gave it a nasty sound. Then there are the two men at the newsstand. She inquires politely about Jamie, to which the man behind the counter retorts, "What do you want him for?" the man asked. He looked at her, smiling, and she realised that there was another man waiting in back of her, and the newsdealer's smile included him. "Never mind," she said, but the newsdealer said, "Listen, maybe he did come by here." His smile was knowing, and his eyes shifted over her shoulder to the man in back of her. She was suddenly horribly aware of her over-young print dress and pulled her coat around her quickly. The newsdealer said, with vast thoughtfulness, "Now, I don't know for sure, mind you, but there might have been someone like your gentleman friend coming by this morning." "About 10? "About 10, the newsdealer agreed. "Tall fellow, blue suit. I wouldn't be at all surprised." "Which way did he go?" she said eagerly. "Uptown?" "Uptown," the newsdealer said, nodding. "He went uptown. That's just exactly it. What can I do for you, sir?" She stepped back, holding her coat around her. The man who had been standing behind her looked at her over his shoulder, and then he and the newsdealer looked at one another. She wondered for a minute whether or not to tip the newsdealer, but when both men began to laugh, she moved hurriedly on across the street. This entire interaction is so cleverly written, and to me it feels so very uncomfortably relatable. The familiarity between these two men, sharing looks, smirks, laughing at the protagonist, it's so threatening and leaves her in such a vulnerable position. She's powerless, her insecurities rising to the surface, menaced as she is by these men, one of whom seems to appear behind her, so she's kind of flanked on either side. This vile, leering assertion of dominance really gets under my skin, as does the creeping, horrible suggestion that these men know something the protagonist does not. They know the truth that she can't see. And with each successive creep she talks to, she is driven further and further towards desperation. As Joanne Harris so eloquently puts it, small details in this story become horribly magnified. The prose has a queasy, lurching gait. The tension racks up until even the most mundane encounter with a florist, a policeman on the street corner, becomes laden with dreadful significance. And underneath it all is the image of the woman, nameless in her own narrative, while even in his absence, the man has not only an identity, but all the agency the protagonist lacks. It's almost as if everyone she interacts with is in cahoots with Jamie, as if they too are in line with some demonic force or other, in league to slowly drain the protagonist's autonomy, or show up the fact she never had any to begin with. Now, why is this, you may wonder? Why doesn't she have any autonomy, any agency? Why is she letting herself get into this situation? Is she just that naive? Well, yeah, perhaps she is. After all, traditionally, the demon lover narrative features a naive and foolish woman as its victim. But I would argue that Jackson takes this trope and makes it a lot more complex. Rather than being completely oblivious to an increasingly worsening situation, the protagonist is deliberately refusing to allow herself to believe that something is wrong. She's 34. She's over the hill. She's barely marriageable, for goodness sake. And she's entirely alone. She can't afford to see Jamie for what he really is. This is her last chance. She's already isolated from her community simply by existing in the world as an older, unmarried woman. She's not blindly naive and foolish. She's sad, lonely, and desperate. We get a really good example of this in her interaction with the florist. So, upon questioning him, he tells her, in no uncertain terms, that a man matching her description of Jamie came in that very morning and bought some chrysanthemums. But despite this being a pretty solid lead, the protagonist refuses to believe it. "Oh, no," she said. Her voice shook a little, and she waited for a minute before she went on. "Not for an occasion like this, I'm sure." Now, chrysanthemums, for the botanically uninitiated amongst you, are the flowers of death. A strange choice for a wedding bouquet, you might argue. So strange the protagonist just isn't having it. But what's significant here is that while her dialogue is dismissive, that shake in her voice, that lengthy pause between statements betray her real feelings, suggesting to me that this is a conscious denial. She knows something bad is afoot. She just can't allow herself to believe it. And the protagonist's conscious denial of the horror she faces persists to the very end. So, after much sleuthing, she eventually manages to track down the apartment building where Jamie was last seen. She speaks to a boy in another menacing encounter, and he tells her that he saw a man, matching Jamie's description, going all the way up to an apartment on the very top floor. She's come this far. There's really no turning back now. She knocked and thought she heard voices inside, and she thought, suddenly, with terror, "What shall I say if Jamie is there? If he comes to the door?" The voices seemed suddenly still. She knocked again, and there was silence, except for something that might have been laughter far away. "He could have seen me from the window," she thought. "It's the front apartment, and that little boy made a dreadful noise." She waited, and knocked again, but there was silence. Finally, she went to the other door on the floor and knocked. The door swung open beneath her hand, and she saw the empty attic room, bare lath on the walls, floorboards unpainted. She stepped just inside, looking around. The room was filled with bags of plaster, piles of old newspapers, a broken trunk. There was a noise which she suddenly realised as a rat, and then she saw it, sitting very close to her, near the wall, its evil face alert, bright eyes watching her. She stumbled in her haste to be out with the door closed, and the skirt of the print dress caught and tore. She knew there was someone inside the other apartment, because she was sure she could hear low voices and sometimes laughter. She came back many times, every day for the first week. She came on her way to work, in the mornings, in the evenings, on her way to dinner alone. But no matter how often or how firmly she knocked, no one ever came to the door. Unlike his centuries-old namesake, Jackson's Jamie doesn't take the protagonist to hell in a tall ship. He does something worse. He makes a hell for her here, on Earth. He makes a hell out of her home, her community, her state of mind. He exposes her deepest insecurities and fears, isolates and alienates her from anything and everything that is good in her life, and leaves her utterly obsessed and undone. He makes a hell out of her life itself. And what's especially interesting about Jamie is that, again, unlike his centuries-old namesake, he remains on the fringes of the tale. The very first sentence of the story introduces us to Jamie. He very much drives the narrative forward, but he is consistently absent. We don't see his face. We hardly hear him speak. We do, however, hear him laugh. She was remembering her own voice saying last night in the doorway, 10 o'clock then, I'll be ready. Is it really true? And Jamie laughing down the hallway. We, as readers, catch only his shadow, the back of his head as he walks away, his disarming, lowering laughter, a sound that dogs us through the narrative. And he's not the only one who finds this whole thing amusing. As the protagonist ruminates, everyone thinks it's so funny. Every person she interacts with scorns her, smirks at her. Count the insolent grins and cruel knowing laughs in this story, and you'll be left with the distinct sense that, just like the protagonist, you are firmly on the outside of the joke. Everyone else gets it. Everyone else understands. Everyone else sees. Even the rat knows something you and the protagonist do not, sitting very close to her, a witch is familiar almost, its evil face alert, bright eyes watching her. You never learn what happened to Jamie, whether or not he ever really existed, or whose whispers and laughter echo from beyond the door. You, like the protagonist, are left very much in the dark, left to the madness of your own mind. Nasrullah Mambrol writes that as James Harris wanders through the book, he sheds the veneer of the ordinary that covers his satanic nature. But I would argue that right here, at the start of The Lottery and Other Stories, the malign intent of the demon lover is already showing through. Jackson doesn't hide him away, not really. Yes, he lurks, but only just beneath the surface. I think Jackson makes it pretty clear that this collection of horrifying stories is intrinsically bound up with the demon lover, in the way he's been imagined and reimagined in literature, but also in the very real effect the belief in demon lovers had on the lives of thousands of individuals, most of them women, during the early modern witch hunts. Jackson exposes how the very real and very destructive fear of witches and witchcraft prevalent in centuries past and rooted in misogyny is really only a stone's throw away from the misogyny of the white middle-class mid-century American domestic sphere. It might look different. It might be covered by a neater, more respectable facade. But it, like the demon lover himself, forever lingers. But, you might be wondering, how is all this relevant to us today? Jackson is writing about a kind of domesticity that is not only white, middle class and American, but situated in a particular time period. We're not in that time period anymore. Haven't attitudes towards women, witchcraft and domesticity changed between 1949 and today? And that is a huge, far-reaching question that would take many video essays from many different perspectives to answer effectively, I think. Instead, I'll leave you with this. Witch hunts are far from over. And I'm not talking about metaphorical witch hunts where an individual is harangued in the press, but literal witch hunts, where individuals are beaten, raped, tortured and killed for the crime of witchcraft. These things still happen around the world today. Here's India Rakison in conversation with Leo Igwe.
Leo has seen firsthand how vulnerable people are more likely to be accused of witchcraft. He's seen many cases of children, but also the elderly, particularly women, and those living with dementia.
So what happens is that because of the medical challenge these people have, when you ask them questions, they don't provide coherent answers. And people associate that with witchcraft, which is very sad, and which is that challenge in terms of health education and also misinformation, because a lot of people associate those incoherent statements and all as a sign that the person is into something occult or strange.
And this is just one example of how people in vulnerable positions in society are still accused of witchcraft to this very day. Being aware of this, being aware of how the context of witch hunts, trials, and beliefs have shaped and continue to shape the lives of individuals, countless individuals, is vital, I think. It's a reminder that these things aren't lodged somewhere in the past or confined to the pages of a collection like the lottery and other stories. The abuse dynamic represented by the demon lover is still with us. The ramifications of, and misogyny inherent to the early modern witch trials are still with us. And the devastating experiences of people today living through these kinds of accusations are still with us. So if Jackson's demon lover is relevant today, it's because he reminds us of the timelessness of abuse, persecution, accusation, and fear. Jackson's writing looks backwards in time, situates itself in a specific domestic present, but it also looks forward, both reminds us of the horrors of the past and warns us about the horrors of a potential future. Jackson's horror is so captivating and stomach-churning precisely because it is rooted in what makes us human, and the inescapable fear that we might turn against our better instincts, or that we might be the one turned against, isolated, and delivered a fatal blow. If you want to learn more about another accused woman and her gothic reimagining in literature, watch our video on murder, menstruation, and the case of Lizzie Borden by clicking here next.